Shall we start?
Yes, please.
Diedrich, could you maybe explain a bit what cybernetics of the poor means, and why is it relevant today to do a show like this?
Why is it
relevant today to do a show like this?
Yeah, cybernetics of the poor is a metaphor, and it was guiding Oya Echeverria and me when we were making the show. We had other metaphors before that we were using, and at one point we reached this one, and it's supposed to refer to a situation in which the cybernetic organization of the world, especially the capitalist Northwest, but basically the whole global situation, has reached a new stage. And in order to explain this, I have to go back a little bit. The idea is that cybernetic organization has started in the post-war world already. When this term appeared, it was not only starting something new, but also describing something that already existed. The classical image for how cybernetics work is the idea of self-controlling systems, like, for example, a machine that's not supposed to get too hot. So there's a ventile. I don't know what that's in English.
Ventilator.
It will react if the temperature becomes too high, and then it will open some other thing, and so steam will go away. So and the system, the machine can cool down, and so this happens automatically. Some mechanism starts the other mechanism, and this starts another mechanism, and they react. They feel and they react towards the feeling. They feel it's too hot, and they react. So that's basically the most basic idea. And it's a mechanism, or it's a structure in which you have input towards the system is felt, and there's a reaction towards that, and it can be planned what kind of input will cause what kind of reactions, and this becomes theoreticized during the war, basically by Norbert Wiener, and they are kind of applying it on war questions, like basically on how to shoot down German fighter planes, and that do kind of strange movements and how they can be anticipated while shooting them down. And they develop categories, and it becomes more sophisticated. Norbert Wiener writes 2 books on them. One has the subtitle on the use of humans and machines. No, on the use of humans and machines. So it's like already kind of dealing with the machine-like aspect of humans and the human aspect of machines. That's kind of a big topic within the discussion. And one important category is feedback. So that feedback it's often popular. The popular understanding of feedback is that something reacts to something that happens. But basically, a feedback is a no. It's a negation. It's like here something has happened that leads us to alter the course because there's a negation. And then in the late 40s, early 50s, there were these amazing conferences in which not only like physicians, mathematicians, and other natural scientists talk about cybernetics, but there's also Gregory Bateson and Margaret Mead. There's ethnography, there's psychology, and so it becomes more and more applied on social situations. And in the post-war period, this is like a tendency to address cybernetically traffic planning, social housing projects, and so on. and it's always connected with like basically two discourses. One is this becomes a machine that takes over the human. And one big fear is of course surveillance. Criminology works with cybernetics and tries to anticipate crime, and it has a lot to do with controlling people. So control is the one big problem of cybernetics, and it's reflected in a lot of art and discourse and literature, William Burroughs and Thomas Pynchon and so on. And the other thing is the utopian side, which is like here you have plenty of ways to intervene, to respond, whoever politics or whoever is affected by certain politics or by certain measurements, regulations, has methods to respond and to react, and so there's plenty of ways to respond, and it's no longer a top-bottom model, but it's also one that involves the bottom. So this is the other way cybernetics is interpreted, and but this is more or less the discourse of the 50s and 60s, and in the 70s it's also big in ecology, and after the Club of Rome book about the limits of growth, it becomes system-oriented cybernetic thinking is becomes important in ecological discourses. But the new situation that I was mentioning at the beginning of this long excursion is that in the digital culture we have a cybernetic capitalism, or a digital capitalism, in which all the elements of cybernetics, anticipation, feedback, and so on, are not only used for capitalist means like production, generation of surplus value, and so on, but they become themselves profitable. They're not only means to do what capitalist production has always done, and then just improve this, but it is in itself a product. So this is the new situation. This is what we tend to call in our explanation of the show a total cybernetics, or cybernetic totality, and under these circumstances, art, which is in its self-understanding, the image art has of itself, a type of behavior that cannot be expected, a type of behavior or a type of activity that deals with the unforeseeable, the surprising, the individual, but also resistance and subversion, is kind of all these things are involved not only on the level of governmental behavior. It doesn't only become co-opted by governmental strategies, but also it is all product-like. It has the form of the commodity, because that's exactly the kind of commodity that digital capitalism produces, the English word valorizes. So and under these circumstances, the only thing that art can be is, first, it has to be aware of this situation, and second, it cannot look any longer for being the other to all the other discourses, or the governmental discourses, but it has to kind of acknowledge its own involvedness in this, and also its relatively tiny, the tininess of its weapons and of its methods to defend itself, or to, and of course we are not total cultural pessimists. We're not saying that this totality is already a kind of totality without any escape or any way out. But it's kind of a scenario that one should have in mind, and so art becomes here a cybernetics of the poor.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying that if there is non-exteriority to the system in a way, and this kind of acknowledgement would make this art cybernetics of the poor.
Yeah, but I mean, if there's absolutely no exteriority, there wouldn't even be art. We're still kind of we talk about a tendency, and the tendency has always to be seen in the relation to the totality it leads to, and of course it's nobody is able to really determine which grade of totality we have reached, and this is a question of perspective. But yes, the tendency is there that there's no exteriority to not only the governmental side of cybernetics, but also the economic side. But then, starting with this metaphor and this for a description of the situation, we were also looking into how cybernetics has already been a subject matter in art production, in art discourses in the last 50 years, and realized that it has been reflected many times before. There has been a lot of thought about it, a lot of production based on cybernetics, and in both senses, in the sense of being afraid of or hating or despising cybernetics, but also in the sense of a utopian idea of cybernetics.
Yeah, could you maybe elaborate with some examples from artists that are in the show? Yeah,
we decided to have artists of both kinds, so to say, or with the perspective of contemporary cybernetic totality, especially in relation to the art market. And one can say, for example, that on one hand, we have someone like Tanja Pietman, who's referring to the the daily life of contemporary art objects, art products, and the kind of reception that they get. And she's referring to a specific graffito she's seen on a sculpture in Venice, and how this kind of how this relates to this totality that I've been speaking about. The other perspective would be someone like Paulo Sirio, who in his work Sociality talks about basically the algorithmic nature of most of art production and art-related operations in a more general perspective. So the two of them, I think, would be two examples of how the contemporary situation in relation to art could be described. But then on the other hand, we have people who have related to cybernetics, let's say in the 50s, 60s, 70s, or 50s probably not, but 60s and 70s. And there's work, for example, by Adrian Piper or Elena Anton, people who are who one way or the other address the hopes and the ideas that the whole first wave of conceptual art in the 1960s had with cybernetic thinking, how they were expressed in exhibitions like Information or Software that took place in 1970, in which art would use cybernetic methods in order to produce complex interactions with recipients and producers, and or even get beyond the distinction of the two, and how artistic methods could like program, in quotation marks, daily life and make micro behavior operational. And I think Adrian Piper has a lot to, or had a lot of works referring to that, some of them quite famous, that we have in the show. And also how cybernetically informed acts of resistance are imaginable. So this is like this is a look back at, not all of these works are explicitly related to cybernetics, but one can say that in the 1950s and 60s, this kind of optimist or optimist idea of how art and political resistance could refer to cybernetics is one string or one thread. And the other one would be a position like the one that the Situationists and many of their allies and similar thinking people in the art world developed that hated cybernetics and saw in it an extension of governmental practices and basically the tendency of the so-called Western democracies of the 50s and 60s to replace social progress with technical progress, and social progress replaced by technical progress becomes more sophisticated oppression, more or less. That's the other perspective, and that is also part of
oppression through bureaucracy, like the kind of fascist bureaucracy, or
cybernetic order never looks fascist. It is, but the skeptic perspective would argue that because it doesn't look fascist, it is even more effective in its strategies of control, and the society of control that famously Gilles Deleuze developed as a category doesn't work like a police state. It doesn't need to do that. It has other means of control. We have a text by Alexander Galloway in our catalogue that talks about this essay of Gilles Deleuze, which is, of course, also very present in many fantasies and elaborations of how control functions in this period between, let's say, the beating perspective on control that someone like Willie Burroughs developed, and the 90s, where this category of the society of control had become like a meme almost, no?
Mm-hmm. And maybe why then, and like it would be good to talk a bit about why is it relevant to have such an exhibition in Vienna, and what is the difference between, or what is like the nuance between what happened in Tabacalera and what will happen in Kunsthalle Wien?
Yeah, I mean, there's of course a lot of historical baggage in Vienna that has a relation to that. I mean, it's maybe just a practical joke that the inventor of the category cybernetics, his name is Wiener, but he's an American anyway. But maybe it has some meaning. And of course, there is a certain kind of philosophical background of the idea that the sciences would convert into one meta-science that is an applied meta-science, which cybernetics is, you could call it that, an applied meta-science, or a science that uses the other sciences but under the perspective of systemic thinking, develops a kind of framework for the use of the sciences. And I think in the 20th century, this has been a motive of philosophical thinking from many different directions. But one, of course, is the Wiener Kreis, the Viennese circle of so-called logical positivism or logical empiricism, people like Carnap, Schlick, and Otto Neurath. And Otto Neurath is a case in point for our show, an interesting case, and a very important person for Vienna, who's been a logical positivist and was strongly involved in a project that he called the Unified Science Project, where long before cybernetics, or 15, 20 years before cybernetics, he was, with the help of many important people of the time, John Dewey, Bertrand Russell, Niels Bohr, like from different types of science, to kind of find a common ground for all, not only natural science, but also social and sciences and humanities. And so the interesting thing is that those people who then developed cybernetics in the first place from the perspective of information theory and Norbert Wiener in the US, they did this under the conditions of the war and funded by the military. And the project that Otto Neurath was following was more or less, saw himself as a successor of the French encyclopedists, as some kind of form of enlightenment or continuation of enlightenment, and that was also connected to his other thoughts of education, where he invented this very well-known and very successful principles of visualization, this visual languages which he wanted to use for education all over the world. He and overcoming the problems with written language that had like education problems and translation problems and so on. So it was like this kind of rather leftist, universalist, utopian idea that his project of a unified science was driving or was driven by, whereas the other one was like came from the military. And Norbert Wiener knew about Neurath's project, but Neurath died in 1945 in British exile, so there was no direct connection. But when these Macy conferences happened, they knew about Neurath, but Wiener said, no, it's too leftist for his taste. But otherwise, yes, this could be seen as a forerunner. So, and Neurath not only did all these things, he was also like very much involved in socialist politics in Vienna. He was part of the Rote Wien thing, and he was director of a museum of the social in the Viennese 20s and things like that. Mm-hmm. But he was also, that is interesting, heavily criticized by someone like Max Horkheimer, who saw in the positivist philosophy of science that Neurath and the Viennese circle were representing, the typical form of bourgeois science that is neutral, and that believes that there's such a thing as a neutrality of science. That's what exactly the opposite of what the term critical theory that Horkheimer had invested in a lot, and that he had more or less invented in the 1930s, would be directed against. So that would be philosophy of science, which was based on the idea that there is no such thing as neutrality. Every scientific endeavor is coming from a specific perspective, and so and that would have to be a political position. And Neurath had this political position as a person, but was on a neutralist, a positivist basis. And the interesting thing is that the issue of the Zeitschrift für Sozialforschung, the journal of social research that Horkheimer edited in 1937, in which he attacks Neurath in the same issue. Neurath has a text. He's also an author of it. So they've been connected. It was like a debate within leftist circles, but there was this conflict, and I think it's interesting how this conflict between positivist and critical leftist kind of prefigures the conflicts that situationists and cyberneticists had 30 years later.
Because it is also related to, it's also a critique of complexity, like this idea of a neutral language also simplifies.
Yeah, that's true. That's another aspect of logical positivism, is that it believes in the clarity of what can be said, which is, one can even extend this to famous Wittgenstein quotes from even earlier, whereas a typical position of critical theory is the operatic, the dialectical sentence that is in itself almost paradoxical or almost opaque, and that's clearly another area of conflict. The interesting thing is that there's later in the, let's say, 70s, we have the development of so-called second-order cybernetics, and they try to acknowledge the fact of the impossibility of neutrality in
language,
in thinking, in research, in science, and but they still try to formalize this. They try to formalize the observer-dependent thinking into a form of system theory, whereas the critical theory wouldn't formalize this, but would postulate that you have a position, that you are not neutral.
And sorry, I'm just gonna go back a little bit because now you explained the relevance of this in Vienna and its context, like in Vienna. But I would really love to hear you also talking just a bit about the difference between the two shows, one in the Tabacalera and one in Kunsthalle Wien.
Yeah, the show the Tabacalera had a sub-theme, or had three sub-themes, and three contemporary phenomena that we were thinking of as ideas or as examples of a cybernetics of the poor. That was tutorials, exercises, and scores. And so we were less guided by like those conflicts of the 20th century and how they lead to the present, the way I've been talking about before. But we were more thinking of these contemporary phenomena, or not only contemporary phenomena. So they all deal with ways to anticipate behavior and action, and by defining rules, or by following a score, telling people what to do at what point in time, or by or a tutorial functions basically like a score, but with other means, with other. It again tells people what to do if a certain thing happens, or if a certain temporality has exhausted, or something. And so we were looking at artworks that were somehow dealing with these methodologies. Again, like I described it for this show, under contemporary practitioners, but also historical, in the last 50 years or last 30, 40 years. And that difference is and basically all the works that we were showing could be subsumed under one of the three categories. And that's not the case in the Vienna show. But in the Vienna show we still use some of these. I think half of the works have been shown in Tabacalera as well, and so half of the works belong to one of these three categories. But then we extend it to other questions. Since this has already been explained and exhibited before. But, and especially we got rid of the, not completely, but almost, of the idea of the score. We thought that the score was had several meanings in relation to the idea of the cybernetics of the poor, especially scores that were not used only in a musical, under musical
context.
Yes, but some of them still coming from people who came from music. So Cornelius Cardew or Anthony Braxton were in that show. They are not in the Vienna show because they were extending the idea of what a score could be, and they were using it as a tool for certain social ideas and social means. Cardew used scores, but he tried to organize a commune by it, more or less, and Anthony Braxton similar. And so this has, but this we thought had been shown there at length, and we wanted to continue with other questions as well. And we also have to say that there was a lot of Basque artists and practitioners who have also had interesting investment in forms of the score, like Alex Mendizabal or Elena Asins. And so Elena Asins is also in the Vienna show, but yeah.
With a different work.
Yeah, it's a different work.
But so then what would you say that would be the categories in Vienna?
The what?
Like how would you translate the categories that you had in Tabacalera and Vienna?
I mean, I think that the main thing that is added is work on the contemporary art world, or the contemporary art world, and that's then there's work that is relating to let's say the critique of hippie cybernetics, the way they were developed in California, and the connection between like hippie cybernetics and Silicon Valley. And so the work by Katrin Sturmreich refers to that, or also to a degree also the work by Camila Janam Rashid. And these are kind of related to that. And so we basically we just added 2 or 3 themes. The theme of copyright has already been present in Donostia, San Sebastian, Tabacalera through agency, but we extended that theme also. There's another work by Paulo Silva addresses copyright questions, but there are more, and so copyright and control and the art market are basically the additional themes here in Vienna, and then the historical aspect of the prehistory of cybernetics in Vienna.
Mm-hmm. Like when we were talking about the exhibition, you said that you had this like desire to think about an exhibition about cybernetics that would be also that has a form of surprise, an element of surprise, that this is not per se things that we expect to see when we're talking about cybernetics. And I think this is also, of course, related to this idea of subsumption and non-exteriority of the artworks, to the system that they fight, and to like the resistance from within. But I would love to understand maybe a bit more about this, and maybe you can tell us.
Yeah, I mean,
what is the element of surprise?
The element of surprise is like basically this theme. The way I develop it is huge, and it could you could do a show based on the same principles that I've just declared, that would look completely different. So the specifications through the work of certain artists gives it a very specific feel. And I think that there are some artists in that show what you would not expect there, or you wouldn't see the connection at first, and then it becomes, I would hope, surprising. If you take, for example, let's say 2 examples, the work by Michael Hakimi and the work by Heinrich Diederichsen. Michael Hakimi has drawn scenes from like poverty, one can say, like people selling things on the street, street vendors, but they all had somehow deal with logos, and they deal with the language of capitalist commodity production, and in a very contemporary way. So this is like this kind of, what you see there are scenes of adoption to the system, and at the same time this kind of also through the style of the drawing, this kind of abyss between the living people, the actors and the world they adapt to. And that's something that you would probably not expect in this show as cybernetic. That would not be the first category that you would think of to see this work. But there is this connection to a degree. And the same is true, I think, Heinrich Diederichsen, he passed away, but he's now seen as a kind of classic photographer in Germany, and even an artist. He's an artist photographer, but he started as a press photographer and as a news photographer. And when he was still a news photographer, he had this kind of obsession to photograph people always from the same angle when they ride in an elevator, and so that he really produced surveillance material, but he produced by choice and very artistically, and so this is also, I think, has several elements that have to do with our theme. It's the desire to be like a machine that you don't even know that will be produced later on. The kind of the tension or antagonism between subjectivity and a life that can be anticipated to the tiniest second. And so this is also something, if you just see these photographs, the first thing you think is that you look at all these faces from the 1960s and you think, well, these people are probably all long dead, or you look into their eyes and you have this kind of punctum, Roland Barthes punctum experience with them. But on the other hand, if you look at 24 of them, and we have like 24 of them, they become visible as this kind of proto-cybernetic procedure. And so this is the kind of experience that or this kind of surprise that this show hopefully has to offer.
Great, thank you. If you want to add something, please. There was just another question. I was wondering what you meant by that repetition is the enemy of cybernetics, because in the exhibition there is very much of this idea of repetition. There is this kind of creating data through like a pattern or through...
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, really. Yeah, in a way, cybernetics kind of insults human subjectivity by anticipating it. By the humans have the belief they are unique and have a free will, and what they will do next, no one knows. And cybernetics tells them the opposite. But cybernetics do that by describing or exposing how your erratic individual behavior can be anticipated. But if the humans or if whoever is the object of cybernetic analysis or cybernetic planning, if the object is repetitive, if the human behaves like a machine, that's not good for cybernetics. That's not what it can do. If it, to a degree, if one thinks this to its end, then behaving repetitively means you are autistic. You no longer react to the world around you because you repeat your thing regardless of what happens outside, and that is against the cybernetics.
Because then you won't need to anticipate anything.
Yeah, you don't need to anticipate anything, and also since cybernetics try to address the complexity of systems, that's why they have the category of the system. You behave undercomplex and you behave non-complex, and that's kind of not cannot be processed. So I think there is something in autistic repetitive behavior that is really subversive, and that we have, for among other things, we have several series in the show because they are they have to do with that. Although most of the series are not completely repetitive, they just repeat a frame. But maybe I should add one thing.
Yes, please.
There are 4 artists in the show that I haven't mentioned so far, but in a way they are the most important artists. They were the ones that we developed this with together, and they have developed projects that are probably the most surprising ones. No? And these are Lilian Olivar, Camilla Sposati, Agency, and Jon Michael Euler. All 4 of them have developed original work for the show, already in Tabacalera and again here, that are that were in dialogue with us, and so they are different from other works in the show. They do not illustrate any idea that we have, but they actually act on a similar level. They act in relation to the diagnoses that we were working with, and that is different. So they are in Tabacalera. Each of them had a special place, like a show of their own. We cannot do that here. The rooms do not allow us to do. So they now mingle with the other artists. But I think it's still visible that they are somewhat different.
Maybe you can tell a little bit about what Lily Renaud Desnoyers will be doing in Vienna, that she will
basically
also video here.
Yeah, she's doing this project of a kind of performative institutional critique since a while. So she's inhabiting the space where the exhibition will take place in a very special way. She makes films of herself dancing, naked and painted. Her body is always painted in a different color, and then she's kind of using the institutional spaces, not so much the exhibition spaces, mostly not the exhibition spaces, but the space of the offices like the one we're sitting in right now, or staircases and so on, and she's trying to like exploring these rooms. That's it. And in Tabacalera, this was very interesting because Tabacalera is not mainly an art space. It has an art exhibition space, but it also has lots of kind of spaces that are used by the general public for completely different things. I mean, there is also a design museum, there's also a cinema, so there is like cultural spaces, but there's also there's a lot of rain in Donostia, so often people use for public things the space was a roof, so they go there and they play chess or whatever. So it's like a park somehow, like a public space. And so she's been exploring this space, of course, at 5 o'clock in the morning, something, including the parking situation there, and has cut this with a film that she has shot when it was in use. So it's that's very interesting. You will see this will be in the Vienna show as well. I don't know exactly where she will be filming here, but she will be filming here somewhere. That will be a surprise, yeah. And she also has made a film about the work of Camilla Sposati. So she has done a film with these musical instruments / sculptures that Camilla produces, and that will also be on DVD, I think.
Right. Thank you.
Not for that, thank you.